So welcome to today's discovery session. We're very excited to have Don Henwood here to talk about using email to help solve data problems. And so Don, I pass it over to you to do an intro, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you have the ability to have control.
Okay, all right. I'll share my screen in a minute because I can't talk and walk and chew gum at the same time here. So it's really great to be here. I am a communications consultant. I'm also a former university professor. Actually, back around between 2000 and 2005, I taught communications at the Faculty of Computer Science at Dalhousie University. And that's where I first became intrigued by the kind of workplace communication that IT specialists have to do, because so much of what you do involves bridging the gap between the world of technology and the world of business. So today we're going to talk about one particular way in which you do that, and that is when you are using email as a way to communicate with a project team when you're on solving data problems as part of your work with a company. So I'm going to try to share my screen now. Looks like I need the power to do that, Jen. Okay, looks like I should be able to do that now. All right. So at the moment, I can see the Q&A and I can see my slides. It's not very easy for me to see the chat window. So maybe if there are a lot of questions coming up in the chat, Jen, if you could just alert me, that would be great.
Will do.
Okay. All right. So I start with this picture here. So you're engaged in work on some kind of a data analytics project. You've got a problem to solve. So this is typically, I think, the way we often think about solving a technical problem. We think, well, here's the problem. We're going to get the data, we're going to analyze the data, and then we're going to come up with the solution. But to me, there is a missing piece in the solution. Anybody guess what it is? To me, the missing piece here is actually people. Because my understanding of the environment you work in and my experience working with IT professionals in a variety of fields for the past 20 years tells me that often the missing link to the data involves some kind of communication with people. And people can be a kind of a frustrating link in the chain because they're not always forthcoming with the information that you need. They may not always give you exactly the specific information you need when you get it. So actually, part of being an effective data scientist is learning how to use communication tools like email in such a way that you can really answer this question. How do you get the human cooperation and input you need to solve the data problems, right? It's about collaboration, it's about cooperation. Okay. So email actually is a little bit of an illusion because it really creates this feeling that just because we hit the send button, that suddenly we have communicated, right? And that is really a dangerous illusion to believe. When you send an email, in order to get that cooperation, your email actually has to go over a number of hurdles. So first of all, your message needs to get opened. There has to be a subject line that interests the person on the other end. Then your message has to be easy to skim so that people can very quickly look at it and see whether it's worth actually reading. This is a key point to remember, is that very few people read emails. They skim them very quickly. Then, if it's worth my reading, Then you get over that hurdle and say, okay, the message is actually read. Then your message has to be understood. And then your message has to be prioritized. So simply sending that request for information or a query is no guarantee at all that you have actually communicated, because you have to overcome all of these hurdles. In fact, every email you write, I think of as competing in the inbox. So it's competing for the audience's attention, for their time that they need to take to decipher it, for the energy and the commitment that they need to respond to it. I think another challenge for us in today's workplace particularly is that many of us are used to working on Slack or working with other kind of direct messaging. I know, Ryan, you mentioned you're on Teams. When I've worked on Teams, we've used the instant messaging function there. So we get this idea that we can just kind of fire off something quickly and somebody will fire right back to us. That's not actually how it works with email. So if you are emailing your boss, they may have in their inbox 50 different email messages, and then they may have an archive from the past week or the past month. And when you email them something that's on the top of your mind, because you're working at this stage of the problem right now, it's not necessarily on the top of their mind. So although email feels a lot like texting or direct messaging, it's actually quite a different kind of communication channel that has these particular challenges. So today we're going to look at 4 strategies you can use so that your emails make it past all of those hurdles. So we're going to look at how you establish the right tone for your email audience, how you structure a particular kind of email that we're talking about, and that's a request, so that you grab the audience's attention, how you enable non-experts to understand exactly what you need, and finally, how you motivate your audience to respond to you quickly, because this is all about getting somebody to cooperate with you so that you can get down to the technical work of solving the problem. So that's my tentative agenda. I say tentative because I really want to make sure that you get from today's session something that's of value to you in the work that you're doing now. So now would be a great chance actually to go into the Q&A panel and write down any other questions about email that you're hoping we might get to today. And I'll try to work in as many of those as I can. As I say, I can see the Q&A panel. I can't, for some reason, see the chat panel. It seems to be too many things on my screen. But I'm definitely keeping my eye on the Q&A panel. And in my experience, no question about email is ever too silly. Email is a challenging channel to work with. Okay. So let's look at the first of these items on our agenda. Establishing the right tone for your email audience. So what do we mean when we talk about tone in writing? Well, tone essentially means the way you express your attitude toward 2 things, both the reader and your subject. And when you're trying to get somebody to cooperate with you, your attitude toward the reader is especially important. Thanks, Ryan, for that question about the subject line. We will come back to that and encourage others of you to add your questions as well. So thinking about tone, I'd like you to put yourself now in the position of somebody receiving this message. And I'm wondering how you would describe the tone.
You can feel free to put it in the chat. Someone says aggressive.
Aha. Okay.
Abrupt.
Abrupt. I have the chat window now. I have solved that technical problem. Phew. Okay, that's great. Demanding. Thanks, Tim. Okay. Yeah, it's very abrupt, partly because it's so short. Notice too that it almost has an accusatory tone or a blaming tone. So yes, I see Varsha, blunt. Ryan says in your face. It's a little bit like a slap. You sent me an incomplete data set. You know, you almost see in parens, you moron, right? So there's it's a very short message. The person writing it may not have meant this kind of tone, but because it's so short and blunt and there's no context, it comes across in a way that does not encourage cooperation. Direct and no small talk, Tim says. Yeah. So the thing about email is, of course, we do want to keep it as brief as we can because people have 99 emails or whatever in their inbox, but we need to provide enough of context, enough of the kind of the polite niceties of conversation that we build some goodwill up, because we want this person to do something for me. Imagine that you are Boyd. You know, Boyd has a million things on his desk right now. Does he really want to take the time and send you that third row, right? So we have to kind of get in his good graces. So here's a more respectful and engaging version. And in the chat, I'd love to hear what you notice about this. What difference do you notice about this version, or differences? So we have an explanation of why it's needed, less accusatory. There's that clarification of that why. So there's no use of you. It's polite enough to explain the need. Yeah, thanks, Renata. And that is part of politeness, isn't it? Is to take the time to explain why something is necessary. The first message kind of assumed that, you know, you would just kind of jump. But this shows more consideration. Okay, and then it's specific as to what is needed, and then we have that thank you at the end. So this is a little bit more gracious. Yes, it's a little bit longer, but the polite tone and the effort to provide some context is more likely to get the cooperation that you want. Now, to Ryan's question about what a subject line, what a great subject line looks like, I'd love to get some suggestions as to what you think might be a subject line that would grab Boyd's attention. Oh, some interesting suggestions coming in here. Missing data request, or maybe request for missing data, because it almost sounds like the request is the piece that's missing there. Missing data, need by Thursday. Oh, that's an interesting comment, Ronnie, because it creates that sense of urgency, but it's lacking a little bit of context, I think. So one of the things we have to remember is when we are trying to create that sense of urgency is that what matters to us is not necessarily at the top of the priority list for the person we're writing to. So you need it by Thursday? That's very nice. I've got a ton of other stuff that I'm working on and I don't really care. Right? So you have to give the person a reason to care. Is there a way to do that? You know, data required for Thursday might kind of be a combination there, or data needed to complete analysis or something like that. You want to keep your subject line probably under 10 lines, particularly if the person you're writing to tends to read on a mobile device, where then you want your subject line to be even shorter. But the challenge with subject lines is that they have to fulfill a couple of criteria. On the one hand, what makes a subject line great is that it's very specific. In some cases, that may mean mentioning the particular project you're working on. If the person that you're writing to is engaged on multiple projects, don't assume that they're occupied mentally only with your project all the time. So it has to be specific. At the same time, it has to be very concise, no more than 10 words, and it has to create some kind of a sense of urgency. It has to make the reader care. All right. So we've talked about tone and addressed Ryan's question about subject line. Keep those questions coming. So the second email hurdle that I want to talk about is grabbing the audience's attention. Now, there's a way to structure your email request so that you grab your audience's interest from the get-go. An email request, because it requires a certain amount of context, actually has at least these 5 different elements. So typically there's a little bit of context that creates common ground with the reader so that we're on the same page. Again, you picture your email reader getting your message. You don't know what they're doing at the moment. Their head could be full of any number of things. And so you have to kind of establish who you are and why you're writing. A purpose statement up front tells the reader why they should bother reading your message. Again, do not assume people are reading your email messages. They are skimming. Think about your habits as a web user, because I think web reading has really changed our reading habits, period. But when you go to a website, you don't read word for word. Actually, eye tracking studies tell us, as you may know, those of you who are developers, that we read either in an F pattern or else we read in what's called the layer cake pattern, kind of going from heading to heading and heading. We're not reading word for word. And it's very similar with emails. People are not going to take the time to read word for word. So tell them why they should read your message. Then you may need to provide, in certain cases, some technical background, enough background that they understand the problem that you're trying to solve and how they can help. Then you make your request, your ask. But that's not enough, because if you stop there, your reader might just say, oh, that's nice. Okay, Bobby needs that. Yeah, I've got a ton of other stuff on my plate. So you need to think about how you motivate your reader to respond. Tim, yes, we'll get to email etiquette. That's another great question. Now, the issue with a lot of failed requests, so requests that don't get action in a timely way, is that they tend to just give technical background and then bury the request at the end. So the reader gets lost in the technical background, or they don't see the reason why they should give this email attention. They may never even make it to the request part. Well, let's look at another example. So here's an example of an email that, to me, needs to be restructured. So and this is just the first part. You can see there's no signature. I've just put an ellipsis at the end. You can also see I am not a data scientist, so I have mocked this up, but if there's language here that's not quite right, please let me know and I'll put in my notes to adjust for next time. But I hope this gives us something that we can play with a little bit. So take a minute to read this and let me know in the chat things that you would change to make this conform to the structure that I just presented, that has the context, the purpose statement, the background, and so on. So it's disjointed. I think that's from Jen. So things could be grouped. Yeah. And that's what, as data scientists, you should be very good at. In fact, when I have worked with IT professionals, I think that's one of my favorite parts, is that when I start talking about logical structuring, as IT professionals, you have that logical, kind of structured way of thinking, and it's a matter of applying that to writing. Brian says it's too wordy. The purpose is obscure. No cohesion, says Renata. We might say this is kind of rambling. There's some extra information in there that may or may not be relevant. Okay. So let's look at one way to possibly restructure this. This is a lot shorter. Curious what you think about this. So even though this is shorter, you can see that the structure applies here. So there's a little bit of context up front. I've just finished cleaning the entire data set for stores in Atlantic Canada. So as I said, the person you're writing to is not at the same stage at the project, immersed in it, maybe to the same extent you are. So bring them up to speed very quickly is very critical. There's your common ground that you've established. Oops, then we have a typo, sorry. Note that down for next time. Would you please confirm the categories we're using? So this is an example of a purpose statement. In this case, it's actually a question. I could have said, I'm writing to confirm the categories we're using, but I actually turned that into a question. So right up front, Kutai knows, oh, I better pay attention to this. Something is needed from me. And then we have a little bit of background, again, very brief, leaving out all the rambling stuff about Jillian going off on leave and so on. The categories assigned by Newfoundland don't match the categories used elsewhere, very concise. The attached spreadsheet shows the categories I've applied. Are they correct? So then there's a direct question. And in my experience, one of the ways you can motivate somebody to answer a question in an email is actually to ask a question. So sometimes when we are writing email requests, we forget to actually pose something as a direct question. So we might say something like, the attached spreadsheet shows the categories I've applied. I'm wondering whether these are correct. If you want an answer, ask a question. It almost causes a knee-jerk reaction. Somebody gives you something with a question mark attached to it, you kind of have this almost instinctual kind of habit. You want to reply to it. So make that work. All right, so I see we've got a few questions coming in here. So let me pause for a minute and take some of those. And I'm actually going to work backwards from Ronnie, because I think that's most directly associated with what we were just talking about. So thanks, Ronnie. What's the difference between the purpose statement and a request? Can they ever be the same thing? They can be very similar. Often, and of course, this depends as well on the length of your email, right? So if you have a very short email, you may not need the repetition. But very often what you'll find is that it's good to have a purpose statement up front so the person can see what is needed while you're writing. And then it's very helpful to ask a direct question near the bottom of your email. And that's because people are skimming. So they'll go top, whoop, bottom, right? And so if they miss everything in between, at least they see, oh, and this is what you need from me. And now I can hit send and respond. So I hope that clarifies that. Ronnie, feel free to follow up if that doesn't answer that. Also had a question about CCing and reply all. Oh, that's a really hard thing to get the hang of when you start working in a new organization, is to get a handle on who needs to be CC'd and who doesn't. And one of the complaints that I often hear from employers is that people either under communicate, so they don't keep people in the loop, or they over communicate. And that's like kind of broadcasting to everybody every time you have something to say, and people aren't going to appreciate that. I would welcome comments from others on this. What I would say is that if I'm CCing something to somebody, to me, that means that they have a genuine need to know, that this information is going to be something that's going to affect what they are working on. If I have questions, if I've just joined a project team, and as a consultant, of course, I'm on and off different project teams and working with different work cultures, I will ask. So I might say to the person at the very top of the totem pole, do you want to be CC'd? Or do you want to be CC'd on messages such as this? So that's always the best practice, is to actually just have that conversation to find out, because sometimes you will have bosses who you actually want to be copied on everything. And some people just say, just copy me on items that require actions. It's really worth having that conversation. And Tim, yes, that can be, that can be a good practice, what you suggest there. And again, I would just say, have a conversation if you can. Mirafan asks about sending emails with attached trackers. I am not quite sure what you're meaning by that, Mirafan. So if you could clarify that, that would be great. Are you talking about asking for a read receipt?
I think that's probably what it is, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I don't do that just because it seems kind of like an extra thing, an extra piece of baggage. It used to be a convention many years ago. It seems a little heavy-handed somehow to me now. It would be the equivalent to me of putting an ordinary piece of a letter in the mail, in snail mail, and then paying for registered mail every time you went to send an ordinary letter. It kind of has that kind of feel to me. But again, I would welcome comments from others on that, because people do work in different kinds of environments. And for those of you who are working in environments where there are really high security requirements, that affects email as well. Okay, great questions. Let's go on to our next email hurdle. So if your email actually gets opened and read, we have to make sure that it's understandable. And I'm assuming that in the roles you are in as a data scientist, from what Jen has shared with me, is that very often the people you're communicating with do not have your particular kind of expertise. So they may be experts, they might even be technical experts in another field, but they don't have your particular expertise. That's why I would call them non-experts. So how do you enable them to understand exactly what you need? Well, to a non-expert, the way they typically see a data problem is they're seeing it from far off, right? They're using a telescope. Maybe he's got a periscope. They're from that 30,000 foot view, or they're at least at arm's length. Whereas if you are working on the data problem, you have more of that microscopic view. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. So even if your non-expert is capable with effort of understanding the nitty-gritty of what you're talking about, that really detailed parts of it, that's not kind of how they want to see it. That's not probably where they want to put their energy. I'll just give you an example. Tim brought up the word accountant earlier, and that is an example. I fired an accountant because I had emailed her to ask a question about a particular kind of tax deduction that had to do with healthcare expenses for a small business. And her response was to send me to the Canadian Revenue Agency's webpage and show me the detailed, very technical explanation of all the ins and outs of this particular kind of deduction. Well, that was not helpful. Yes, if I had 20 minutes and I had the inclination, I could go through and parse that all out and understand it. But that's not what I wanted. I don't want to have expertise in that area. Tim, we'll leave that for your wife. So to me, she was not helpful. right? And so that's an example maybe to keep in mind when you think about it. It's not necessarily that the person you're writing to can't understand it, but do they want to put that level of effort in? So your job as a communicator is to make it easy, make it simple for non-experts to understand what it is that you need. So some ways that you can do that. First, avoid jargon. So those are those specialized terms that you use in your professional field. Use very precise language. So instead of asking for some or a few, specify that you want 3 of whatever it is you want. To be very clear about your references. So if you're talking about this or that, make sure it's clear what you're referring to. State your request in a separate paragraph if you can, so make it visually stand out. If you need to use bold type to draw attention to exactly what it is you need, you can use that. And if there's more than one part to your request, or if you're writing an email that contains a couple of different requests, which may be possible, then think about separating those out. So part of making an email readable for your non-expert reader is actually thinking visually, spacing things out on the page so they can see, there's a question all by itself, or, oh, there's in bold exactly what they need from me. So let's take a look at this. Again, a very short email, but what issues do you see here? Again, put yourself in Leslie's shoes. And let's assume that Leslie's a non-expert reader. Let's make her, let's say, a project manager, a manager of some kind. So I'm seeing some questions come up in the chat. Ryan says, what does any of this mean? Yeah, there's a lack of context here, isn't there? So again, it's very brief. This message almost assumes that there has been this steady flow of conversation, right? And I often work on Slack when I'm working with collaborators on projects. And when you're having a direct messaging conversation, it's almost in real time. You're going back and forth. There is that steady flow. But in email, again, we can't know exactly when the person is going to open this. So we need some more context for sure. So here's a possible way we might revise it. And again, I'm interested to see what you notice about this. What differences do you notice here that make this more effective? So I've seen the word context come up a couple of times. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Tim. There are some direct questions here, so the requests are very clear. Anything else you notice? Oh, Ronnie, I like your comment there. I think that's a challenge that's worth playing with. So Ronnie says, if I can get back up there, that it still may need a little bit of context at the beginning to motivate the person to read it. Yeah, I think that this message does assume that the reader, cares about sorting out this data. So I'll throw that out to the group. Take a minute. How might you reword the opening of this message to make it more enticing to the reader? Yeah, so in the chat, you can just enter your version of a new first paragraph. So thanks, Ronnie. Ronnie says, I'm working on phase 1 of the data analysis, which needs to be done by November 24th. And I have a couple of questions. So there's that kind of timeline, that sense of urgency right at the beginning. Yeah. And you really have to know the audience to know how much motivation is required here. But I think Ronnie's change is a good one. Now, if your audience is already really aware of the timeline, you might need that. But I think the fact that it's mentioned at the end indicates that, yeah, maybe they do need that bit of context up front. Others have pointed out the bold here as well. Oh, sorry. Yeah. One of the things I want to point out as well is that this is what we might call kind of an omnibus email, in that it gets 2 questions across in one email. Now, email is tricky that way. And it can often be hard to determine, do I send this in one email? Do I send 3 emails? Oh, that partly depends on what your relationship is with the reader, what the workflow is, what the work culture is. You want to think about ease on the reader's end. So what is going to make it easiest for the reader to respond to your request? So if you have, as is the case here, 2 or 3 or maybe 5 related requests, let's say they're all issues that have come up with this particular task you're doing, then I would put those in one email, because that makes it very easy for Leslie on the other end to just go in once to her file, whatever she has to look at, and answer all those questions. What that might mean is that as you are working along, it might mean that you don't fire it off an email every time you see a problem. It may be that you kind of keep track of the problems that are coming up, and then maybe you send an email once a day or once every 2 days, whatever it is, so you don't kind of bombard the reader. On the other hand, what you don't want to do is to cram into one email multiple subjects. So let's say you had these questions about sorting the data, and then you had another question about taking vacation next week, or another question about ordering a new piece of hardware. I probably wouldn't put those all in the same email message. I would probably sort those out. And the thing to remember about subject lines is, if your subject line is specific and concise, one of the things it does for your reader is it enables them to file their messages, to sort their messages easily. And again, as data scientists, I think you should be good at that, at thinking about how your subject lines can enable your reader to quickly sort and prioritize their tasks. Okay, so pause there for a moment and see what other questions come up in the Q&A. We have been talking throughout about how you write these email requests so that you engage your audience and you gain their cooperation. So we have been talking a lot about, in fact, about persuasion and motivation. But the final hurdle that you have to get over with your email is, once the person has decided it's worth reading, they've understood it, they know what's expected of them, what you need, well, then you still have to motivate them to put this new task that you've just put on their plate at the top of their to-do list. So the closing of an email is actually as important as the beginning, because every reader essentially wonders, why should I bother? Right? All of us in the workday, we have a number of fires to put out. We have deliverables due. We have some people breathing down our neck. So why should I care about your little email message? Okay. So some ways to motivate your audience to reply. So you might provide a specific timeline with a rationale. For instance, and I'll actually write this in the chat, you might indicate that something can't happen unless you get this piece of information on time. Or to flip that around, you might say, this will enable me to do such and such. So you might say something like, provided I get the correct data from you by Tuesday, I'll be able to complete the report Fred is expecting on Wednesday. So you can kind of make a kind of a cause and effect. Sometimes you need to say, I'm actually, until I get this from you, I can't go any further, right? Sometimes you need to say that. You need to make it really clear why you just say, give it to me by Tuesday. That's pretty hard to say, particularly if you are writing upwards. So if you're writing to a manager, there's an art in kind of giving a timeline without actually trying to boss the boss. So sometimes I will say something like, if you could get back to me by Monday afternoon, that would be great, as I'm planning to complete this phase for our meeting on Wednesday. So you can kind of say if then. So rather than just saying, I need this by Monday afternoon, there'd be an issue with tone there. You can say, if you could get back to me by this, I'd really appreciate it. Or even better, I'd appreciate it because it will enable me to do this. You can invoke the authority of someone your audience respects. So in the earlier message, I talked about Fred, right? Sometimes you want to lead with a name like that. So you might say, the client, let's say you're dealing with a client situation. The client's VP of sales is coming to the office. Let's pretend we're in a world where we have offices again and not just virtual space. It's coming to the office next week. So please share your feedback by the end of this week. So client's VP of sales, or we might say, Jack has asked for phase 1 to be complete by such and such a date. So if you could do such and such, you know, that would be super helpful, or that would be great. Name dropping can be very effective. Express appreciation. So in one of the revisions that we looked at, we noticed that it ended with a thank you. So whenever you are making a request, remember that tone piece, and remember, you know, as your mom would say, remember your manners, your pleases and your thank yous. And sometimes part of that is letting people see the impact maybe of what it is that they're supplying. Maybe what seems like maybe what is quite a small task will actually make a big difference to the success of what you're doing. The other thing you can do is end with a question confirming understanding and action. So you might say something like, ideally, I'd like to get the new data by Friday morning. so that I can wrap up the analysis by the weekend. And then I might say something like, is that doable on your end? You know, does that sound reasonable to you? Is that manageable? Will that, or I might say, will that work for you? So again, there's a way of stating your need and providing that timeline, but also deferring to the person. So you know, the person then might come back and say, well, actually, I can't do Friday morning, but I can get it to you Friday at noon. Right? And again, when you end with a question, the advantage is that you encourage a reply. Because when you raise a question, you've then engaged the person in a conversation. And actually, that is what email is. It's essentially a way, a channel for carrying on conversations at work. And where email writing tends to go awry is when we start thinking about it as just a way of kind of sharing technical information, and we forget that it is actually about having a conversation with someone. And so including some of these kind of social niceties, remembering to say please and thank you, remembering to provide the context, to show the why, explaining why you need the information, all of these kinds of things, they help with collaboration. They help create that sense of conversation, and they make the other person want to collaborate with you. And that's really the thing here is email writing is, I would say, a key collaboration skill. And it's one of the #1 skills that employers are looking for these days. And so I would really encourage you, when you're sending off even some of these short email requests, to really think about how you can invite your audience to collaborate with you as you solve data problems together. So I'm going to pause there. We have lots of time for questions. So if there are more questions about email etiquette, anything related to email, please fire away. What resources do you recommend for somebody trying to get better at email writing? There is a really great book called, let me see if I can put it in the chat. I think Curry is the author. I'll put that with a question mark, but it's called Be a Brilliant Business Writer. That's a book I quite like. Yeah, I'm also working on some online courses. And so one of the things I'll say is that, you know, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or if you want actually a copy of this slide deck, you can send a message to this email address. I will be starting up a newsletter probably in the next month or so, and I'll be reaching out to folks and asking them whether they want to receive that. I'm actually starting now to build an online writing platform that will have different coaching options and programs as well. Really, one of the best resources is a mentor. And I think when I recently interviewed about 25 young engineers and asked them how they had learned to write. So these were people just kind of stepping into a leadership role. And universally, really, people didn't say, well, I learned this in my writing course in school. They said, I learned from feedback I got from other people, and I learned from observing what worked and what didn't work. So again, you are all very analytical folks. So you can use those analytical skills. And when you send an email and you don't hear for 3 days, you know, try something else. You know, kind of look back and see, does it have all these elements? that it should have? How was my tone? Did I give the person a reason to care about my email and a motivating reason to respond? And then you can try different things. And you can also pay attention when you see management write emails, and notice, what do the leaders in your workplace do in terms of email writing? What makes their emails effective and easy to read and easy to reply to? Another question to think about actually is, think about the emails you receive and what frustrates you. So actually a last question for us to think about is, what are some of your pet peeves about emails that you receive in the workplace? Could enter those in the chat. I'll bet we'll get quite a list. What are some of the things you notice when other people email you that are frustrating or confusing? So over communicating, so just a thank you that goes to a list of 20 people, something that's too vague, no name. When someone answers the first question, but not the rest. Okay, not enough context, not bothering with plus. Oh, people who don't read the whole email. Okay, thanks, Keegan. So this is actually, again, use your problem-solving brains. Okay, and think about, so some of these problems that crop up that cause you frustration, what are some of the solutions that you can take from what we've talked about today, right? So if somebody's not reading your whole email, is that maybe because you haven't spaced out the items well enough, because you haven't had a purpose statement at the top, because you haven't bolded some key words? What can you do? So that's often a good place to start, is to kind of list your frustrations, and then you can go back through something like this deck and say, okay, what little tweaks can I make here to help the reader so I can overcome those hurdles, get their attention, and get to the top of their list? Yeah, wordiness. I think it was Blaise Pascal, the mathematician, and actually Mark Twain says a version of this too. So I'm not sure whom I'm paraphrasing. They both said something very similar. I think it was Pascal who wrote in a letter, he said, "I'm sorry this letter is so long. I did not have time to write a shorter one." And that is so true, that very often to create an email that gets a quick response takes a lot of effort on your part. So it may be that the first email you write is a brain dump, and then it's through the conscious restructuring and rearranging of it that you make it so that it's something that's going to be very motivational for the person to respond to. But that takes some work on your end. It doesn't often happen on the first time. And as Tim mentions, sometimes email is not the best route. It might be Slack. It might be picking up the phone. If there's a complex thing you have to sort through, email is not the answer. I usually find if I'm sitting there stuck, I can't figure out how to start the email, I just I had to pick up the phone. Yeah, so keep that in mind. Do you suggest a time limit for how long to spend on an email? Yikes. Well, some emails are very, very important. Some emails can make or break a project. Particularly if you're dealing with multiple stakeholders and you want to keep everybody happy. So I sometimes have an important email, I could spend 30 to 45 minutes on it to craft it. If it's a marketing message that's going out, I might even spend a little bit longer. I think you have to evaluate what's at stake. So a routine email you want to get so you produce those very quickly. But think about, what is at stake? I will say this in terms of guidance, in terms of time management. Where people often run into trouble with writing, and I do a lot of work with this when I coach people, where people run into trouble is that they tend to spend most of their writing time just getting the words out. And as I've just said, really a lot of writing, a lot of creating that effective email is having the ability to revise, to restructure, to tweak the language, and then eventually to proofread. So when you think about an email, and let's say you have 20 minutes to write an email, my guidance for you would be to say, take a third of that time to actually draft the email, and then allow a third of that time for your planning, and a third of that time for your revising and editing. So if I know I have 20 minutes, let's make it 15, because that's an easy division into 3. If I have 15 minutes to write an email, to get an email off my desk, then I tell myself I only have 5 minutes to get the words out, to get the first draft out.